All of us use our imagination all the time. Sometimes we use our imagination to the positive. Sometimes we use it to the negative. So we've understood that imagination is seeing something not seen before or seeing it in a different way. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. When you look at yourself, when you stand in front of the mirror, when you are in bed alone with your thoughts at night, how do you imagine yourself to be? What kind of an image comes to your mind when you think about yourself? When you listen to the thoughts that roll through your mind, what do you hear yourself telling yourself? When you're faced with challenges in life, do you see yourself as somebody who can conquer the challenge, or is the challenge intimidating to you? When you're in a room and suddenly a group of people gathers around you, you come to church on a Sunday. You go to the office tomorrow. You gather together with family, and suddenly you're with a strange group of people or a familiar group of people, and you start to look at the group and you look at yourself. Where does your imagination go, and what do you see? When you're alone with your thoughts, what do you hear? But the most important question that we want to answer today is this one. When God, your Creator, looks at you, when God, your Creator, looks at you, what is it that He sees? For the last few weeks, we've been talking about heart attacks, and it's not the physical, literal heart, but it's the things that attack our spiritual heart. It's the things that attack our emotional heart. Your heart, the essence of who you are, what you feel, and how you think. We've talked about things like fear. Fear attacks our heart. We've talked about unforgiveness attacking our heart. We've talked about the deceptiveness of our heart. And I think one of the things that attacks a lot of our hearts is this thing called self-image. It's how we see ourselves. It's how we feel about ourselves. Here's what goes on. The problem is that we have a standard that we judge ourselves by. All of us in this room get our self-esteem by things that we see or things that we've experienced. And so often what we do is we make comparisons to establish who we are and how we should feel about ourselves based upon moving standards. We will get into a room with a group of people, and we will decide how we should feel about ourselves or think about ourselves based upon who else is in that room. We will turn on our television set and we will see the accolades and the accomplishments of other people. And we will base all of these things as a standard for us on how we should feel about ourselves. And here's what we tend to do. The standard moves because the standard of judgment for us moves because we're always looking for a standard in our life that helps us feel better about ourselves than we do. Because all of us in this room struggle with a self-esteem issue. But you understand there's only one standard that we need to judge ourselves by. One standard. And the standard that should be there in our lives that determines how we see ourselves, how we think about ourselves, how we feel about ourselves, should be our Creator, our God. The problem is we've had a lot of other creators in our life. A lot of things in our lives have created our self-image for us. Abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, abandonment, past relationships, tragedies, neglect. Messages that are forever etched, scribed indelibly on our heart and in our mind. And sometimes it's even by our own choices that these things happen as well. There's a guy that we talk about in the Bible a lot, one of the most famous characters. His name is Moses. If you don't know who Moses is, that's fine. You can read about him way back in the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. You can go back and read about this guy named Moses. I identify with Moses, and you're going to see why I identify with him in just a moment, and maybe you will as well. Moses is living in Egypt. He's not an Egyptian. He's a Jew. He's got a burden for the Jewish people who have been enslaved by Pharaoh. He'd like to see them delivered and extracted out of the nation of Egypt, but they're in bondage currently, and God is looking for a deliverer. Moses has a burden for his people, but he doesn't know what to do with it. He acts upon the burden, and as he acts upon the burden, he ends up killing a guy. Moses, a famous Bible character, is a murderer. And then after he commits the murder and is found out, he's a fugitive. He runs. And for 40 years, he runs from his past, not wanting to deal with the possible consequences. Ends up herding some sheep. He's about as far away as you can get from anything. I mean, he's further away from people than North Dakota is from anywhere else. I mean, he is out there in the middle of nowhere, and he's herding sheep. And God looks for him there. You know the story, perhaps, about a bush that's on fire, but it doesn't burn up. Moses goes there at that bush, and he begins to have a dialogue with God. And it's this dialogue that he has with God that I want to hone in on today a little bit and see if you and I can identify a little bit with him. I'm going to be in Exodus, beginning in chapter 3. And here's what God says to Moses. He says, Moses, you're going to be a deliverer because I am the God. I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's saying, I'm the God of your ancestors. You know what I love about that statement right there? Don't miss it. He is the God of our past. All of us in this room have a past. I thought about it a little bit. We all have pasts that end with T-I-O-N-S. The shuns. That God is the God of our past, our abortions, our addictions, our convictions, our violations. He's the God of the past, but he doesn't quit on us. He doesn't give up on us. He's always there, and he's always going to be there. And he's followed us from there to here. And when our past attacks our heart and wants to attack how we see ourselves, God is still there. He sees the potential. The dialogue continues, verse number 9. Look, God says, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abuse them. Verse 10, now, I want you to go, for I'm sending you, Moses. You might see yourself as a murderer and a fugitive, but I see something different. I'm sending you to Pharaoh. You've got to lead my people Israel out of Egypt. God saw a leader. I don't think that's what Moses saw in himself at all. You know, when you're out in the wilderness herding sheep, how many know you got a lot of time to think? You might not herd sheep, but you got time to drive a vehicle all by yourself, sit in a chair, stare out the window, lay in bed and sleepless nights and think about life. Moses has a protest, verse number 11. I love this. But Moses protested to God. God, look, who am I? Who am I to appear before the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? The continuation of the dialogue seems to indicate that God is saying, look, if you just go, I'll be with you. I'll be with you. Don't be afraid, Moses. Moses continues to protest. Chapter 4, verse number 1. Moses protested again. Well, what if these people don't believe me or listen to me? What if they say, you know what, the Lord never appeared to you? You know what we tend to do? Whenever we are faced with challenges, we always look at our own ability. We start to take an inventory of our past life. We think about not past successes, but our past failures. We looked at the things that have happened to us, how we've been victimized and been the victim, how we are down here and everybody else is up here. How could we do anything? How could we accomplish anything? How could we be successful? We have no ability, but God looks at us and He knows our ability. We have no clue. Remember, He's the author and the creator of our lives. God's not going to take no for an answer. Look what He says in verse number 2. Then the Lord asked him, He says, what's that in your hand? Robin, can you get that shepherd's staff for me once again? He says, what is that in your hand? And this is what I love about this story. This is what I love. He says, what's that in your hand? And remember, we heard it right from Lily herself this morning. This is Moses' staff. This is the same one he had right here. Okay? You know what God does? He asks Moses, what do you have, Moses? He doesn't ask Moses what he doesn't have. He concentrates on what Moses does have. For 40 years, Moses has had this stick in his hand. It is saturated with the salt and the sweat that come from his hands as he walks through the desert. He knows this shepherd's staff intimately. God says, what's that in your hand? He says, it's just a shepherd's staff. Next verse, God says, Moses, throw it on the ground. And it turns into a snake. It turns into a snake. It turned into a snake. And Moses jumped back. I don't think he jumped because it was a snake. Moses had seen other snakes. He's been in the wilderness for 40 years. I think the reason Moses jumped is because in Moses' mind, this was a stick, and the only thing it would ever be was a stick. Moses' imagination could not imagine this to be anything other than what it was. And isn't it true for yourself? That you only see yourself for what you think you are. You can never imagine yourself to be anything better, to have any greater accomplishment, to ever get to a better place in life, to be more than you are, because all you have ever seen yourself to be is a worthless old stick. You can't imagine what God can imagine, but I'm telling you, God has a great imagination, and he sees things in you that you could never imagine for yourself. Things that if God would unfold it for you and tell you about it today, it would scare the living pants off you, because God believes in you. Then the Lord told him in verse 4, grab it by the tail, and so Moses reached out and he grabbed it, and it turned back into a shepherd's staff right in his hand. God's trying to exercise and demonstrate Moses' imagination a little bit. I want you to understand that God's imagination combined with your limitation can accomplish so much. Verse 10, Moses is still not convinced. Verse 10, he says, look, oh Lord, I'm not very good with words, and I never have been. In fact, I'm not even now, and I know that you've spoken to me, but I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled. Here we go again, Moses. You are just like the people that I'm pastoring in LifeChurch. You tend to look at what you can't do instead of what you can do. You tend to look at yourself and make comparisons, and all you can see is what you can't accomplish instead of what you can accomplish because you're there with God. It's a self-perception. It's your self-image. It's your self-talk. And no self-confidence inside of you. But I want you to understand that your perception is not truth. And then verse number 11. I've struggled with the next verse a little bit. Look what God says to Moses. He said, Moses, who makes a person's mouth? This is a rhetorical question. We know the answer. Who decides whether people speak or don't speak, and hear or don't hear, see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? I want you to understand something, that God is the giver of our faculties. He is the giver of our faculties, and he's the provider in our deficiencies. He's the giver of our faculties, and he's the providers in our deficiencies. When we are weak, then he is strong. He has always been there with you, and he always will be with you. This is what I love about what he's saying. He's always been there with you. You are uniquely created and designed just the way God wants you to be, with all of your limitations. There are no perfect people in the world, but there's a perfect God that supplies when we are insufficient. Listen to what the psalmist said in Psalm 139. Oh Lord, you've examined my, say it with me, heart. And you know everything about me. He goes on to say in the next verse, he says, you know my thoughts, even when I'm far away. You go before me, you know my future, and you follow me. You know my past. He knows about the thoughts of insecurity, self-doubt, comparing yourself and always coming up short. And you know, if you're a parent, you kind of get this. If you're a parent, you've understood this, because if you're a parent, at some point in your child's life, if they haven't already, they're going to come to you and tell you what they can't do. They're going to tell you that somebody's better than them. They're going to cry about themselves. They're going to cry over how they see themselves, how they perceive themselves. And you're their parent. And as a parent, you think your child is the most amazing child in the whole world. And you do everything you can in that moment to speak life into your child. Oh, baby, you are amazing. You can accomplish great things. You need to try, and I believe in you, and I love you. And if you, a human being parent, can do that to your human child, where do you think that came from? Where do you think that heart of compassion and empathy and love came from? It came from your Heavenly Father, who looks at you and looks at me and says, it's not about what you can't do, it's about what you can do. I believe in you. You can do this. You're amazing. Stop looking at everybody else. I love you. Just look at me and look at my face for just a moment. He says in verse 13, God, you made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. You know what that tells me? That when you're created, there's intention in that creation. This last week, our kids got together and did little clubs at camp. They had art club and a preaching club, a nature club and a photography club, and they did all kinds of kind of fun things. And we got to see the results of what they did. You know, if you create a picture or some sort of craft project, it looks the way you wanted it to look. And it looks different than somebody else's. Because you made this particular project to be your project. Come on, guys, you go out in the garage, you might create something with the tools that you have out there. This is yours. It is uniquely and distinctly yours, and it has your flavor and your flair on it. When a child is in the mother's womb, at 5 months, right around that 5-month mark, something amazing goes on. Doctors and scientists will tell you it's probably one of the most complex parts of creation in a mother's womb. That the nerves from the eyeball join and connect with the nerves from the brain. It is an amazing process because the nerves are so incredibly complex and complicated. And an optic nerve is created at about 5 months in vitro. Now, when I was being knit together in my mother's womb, something happened at 5 months, and God said, we're going to make Chris a little bit different. And I was born with the deficiencies in my vision. But I know what I can do through Jesus Christ who gives me strength. Who would have ever imagined that a blind preacher could stand up and talk to you Sunday by Sunday? Oh, I'm not blind. I see what you got something on your shirt right here. No, I'm just kidding. All right. I always want to keep you guessing so you never really know what I can see and can't see. And stop making that face back there, third row from the back. All right. And you know what he says about how God created him? Look at this in verse 14. This is awesome. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well, say it with me, I know it. You know what? The psalmist here, whoever wrote this, came to terms with how they were made and who they were. Can you do the same? Can you finally accept who you are and how you're made and stop comparing yourselves with somebody else and say, I am God's workmanship. I am God's workmanship. Who made you? Who made you? Who made you? His name is God. Who made you? His name is God. You are His workmanship. You are His workmanship. You were on the bench on the table, and God, the Creator, got out all of His tools, and He made you exactly the way He wanted to craft you and design you, with all of your limitations and with all of your abilities. You are a unique gift in a package that God placed in this world to do great and awesome things. And don't you compare yourselves with somebody else and say, I am not what they are. God sees you so differently. I want you to understand that God does not compare us with anybody else, and He has no favorites. He doesn't compare us with anybody else, and He has no favorites. Verse number 17. How precious are your thoughts about me, O God? They cannot even be numbered. I can't count them. They outnumber the grains of sand. Have you ever been to the oceans? Have you ever seen the expanse of beach and all of the grains of sand? Somewhere along the line, the psalmist kind of got a vision of that. And he was overwhelmed and blown away by the reality that God thinks about me more often than there's grains of sand along the seashores. And in verse 1, when we started out, he started talking about the heart. And he's not done yet. Look at verse 23. Here's his prayer. Search me, O God, and know my heart. He says, test me and know my anxious thoughts. Isn't it true that we have anxious thoughts? Those anxious thoughts about being afraid, those anxious thoughts about not being good enough, those anxious thoughts about not looking the right way, those anxious thoughts about not being the best mom, the anxious thoughts about not being the kind of mom that I see on Facebook, the anxious thoughts about not being the kind of provider that I see the guy down the street being. Isn't it true that we have those anxious thoughts, anxiety over not being good enough, over the past, the things that were stolen from us in the past, the things that we think are stolen from us in the present, the anxiety over not doing everything that we think we ought to be doing, the anxiety over not having all the accomplishments and accolades and titles behind our name. And isn't it true that we have anxiety over not being good enough? And then he has this really huge prayer in verse number 24. And I'm almost done, and I want you to think about what he prays and think about this a little bit. Look at verse 24. Here's his prayer. Point out, God, I want you to point out anything in me that offends you. And lead me along a path of everlasting life. I think what he's saying is, God, when I have negative thoughts about myself, when I think about, I'm such a failure, when I think thoughts like, you're such a loser, when I embrace the thoughts about guilt because I should be a better mom, when I think about my past and all the things that I hope nobody else finds out about, I wonder if that offends God. Because God is our maker and our creator, the one who loves us, the one who believes in us. God, show me the things that I think about that hurt you. Not that I intend to offend you. It's just that you believe in me more than I believe in myself. And I don't want to be like that. Because the result is, if we can believe in us what God sees in us, look at the results in that. It's a path of everlasting life. God just simply says this. He says, go. Would you just go? And would you live life? Would you be the student in school? Would you be a mom, a dad? Would you just be a person? No matter where you go, no matter who you are, what you try to accomplish, no matter what you put your hands to, just go. I will be with you. And when God looks at you with an imagination. Would you look at yourself and have a little imagination as well? Let me put a final thought up here that I want you to think about today, and it's this. Imagine yourself to be all that God imagines you can be. That's what I want you to think about for a little bit this morning. Imagine yourself to be all that God imagines you can be.